If something inside you paused when you clicked this video, that pause matters. Not because your mind understood anything yet, but because a quieter part of you recognized a familiar tone. If you're hearing these words right now, it's not because an algorithm guessed correctly. It's not because you were bored, and it's not because you were searching for answers. There is a very quiet intelligence inside you that moved your hand before your thoughts caught up. You didn't come here to learn something new. You came here to remember. Not memory as facts or information, but remembrance as a feeling. That sense you've had lately, that life is no longer operating on the same rules it used to. Something feels off, and yet, strangely, also right. You're not lost, you're not late, and you're certainly not broken. You are standing at the edge of a deep shift in awareness, what many people call fifth-dimensional awareness. Not a place you travel to, but a way of being that is beginning to breathe through you. And it often begins quietly, not with fireworks, not with visions or dramatic moments, but with a subtle loosening, like a river that stops forcing itself upstream and finally remembers how to flow. You may have noticed it already. The things that once motivated you don't pull the same way anymore. Conversations feel thinner, old routines feel heavier, and the future you used to chase no longer excites you in the way it once did. This isn't failure. This is not burnout, and it is not you losing your drive. This is what happens when consciousness outgrows its old container. For most of your life, you were taught to live from effort, from tension, from control, from proving, fixing, managing, and pushing. You learned that if you tried hard enough, if you stayed alert enough, if you worried just a little more, life would eventually reward you with safety. But fifth-dimensional awareness begins the moment that strategy stops working. Not because you did it wrong, but because you've done it long enough. At this level of awareness, life no longer responds to force. It responds to frequency. Think of it like tuning an old radio. You don't get a clearer signal by hitting the device harder. You get clarity by gently adjusting the dial. That's what is happening inside you right now. Your nervous system is learning a new language. Your body is releasing patterns it used to call normal. Your mind is slowly realizing that it doesn't have to run the show anymore. And this is where many people get confused. Because the early stages of awakening don't feel peaceful at first. They feel disorienting. Sleep becomes irregular. Your appetite changes. You crave quiet more than stimulation. And you feel a strange pull toward simplicity, even while the world around you grows louder. This isn't withdrawal from life. It's recalibration. You are no longer wired to live in constant reaction. In the old mode of consciousness, life felt like a series of problems to solve. Fear quietly shaped decisions. Time felt like an enemy. And the present moment was just a bridge between regret and anticipation. But as awareness deepens, something shifts. You begin to notice space between what happens and how you respond. The same situations arise, but they don't hook you the same way. You still feel emotions. You're not becoming numb, but emotions move through you. Instead of taking over the steering wheel, it's like standing on the riverbank instead of being swept downstream. And from this place, something extraordinary happens. You stop trying to control outcomes, not because you've given up, but because you finally understood that life moves best when it's allowed. This doesn't mean passivity. It means alignment. You start listening differently, not just to words, but to energy. You notice how certain environments drain you within minutes, how certain people feel heavy, even when nothing is wrong, how your body tightens around some choices and softens around others. This is not imagination. This is intelligence. Your body is not separate from consciousness. It is consciousness in motion. And as your awareness expands, your body must adapt. That's why you may feel sensations you never paid attention to before. Subtle waves of heat, tingling, pressure, or a sudden need to rest without explanation. Nothing is malfunctioning. Something is upgrading, just like an old house creaks. When new wiring is installed, your system is learning how to hold a higher degree of presence. At this level of awareness, you also begin to experience a different kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of seeing more than most. You notice patterns others don't. You feel undercurrents others dismiss. And when you try to explain what you're sensing, words often fall short. This can be painful. but it's also sacred, because awakening doesn't pull you away from humanity. It simply asks you to meet it with clearer eyes and a softer heart. You begin to see that not everyone who hurts you is your enemy. Many are simply operating from wounds they don't know how to name, and instead of judgment, compassion arises. Not pity, but understanding. You stop needing others to be different in order for you to be at peace. That's when forgiveness becomes natural, not as a moral act, but as an energetic release. And here's one of the deepest shifts of all. Time begins to loosen its grip. Moments stretch, hours disappear, and presence becomes richer than planning. You realize that the only place life ever meets you is now. Not because the past didn't matter, and not because the future doesn't exist, but because awareness is the doorway through which all timelines pass. Where you place your attention is where reality organizes itself. This is not mystical language. It's how consciousness works. And as you stop chasing becoming something else, you begin to embody who you already are. Not special, not superior, just awake. Awareness is not a trophy, it's a responsibility. To live gently, to choose honesty over performance, to move from coherence instead of force. So if life feels quieter lately, if ambition has softened into clarity, if you feel called to simplify rather than accumulate, nothing has gone wrong. You are not losing yourself. You are coming home. And home, in this sense, is not a place. It is the moment you stop fighting yourself and allow life to move through you the way it always wanted to, like a river that finally remembers. It was never meant to flow uphill. 1. You begin to feel that time is no longer linear. There is a moment when you start noticing that time does not behave the way it used to. Not in a dramatic or cinematic way, but quietly, almost politely, as if reality itself is asking for your permission to loosen its grip. Hours can disappear without warning when you are fully present, deeply engaged, or simply at peace. And then, without explanation, a single moment can stretch so wide it feels like it contains an entire lifetime. You are not losing track of time in the careless sense. You are touching something more subtle, something older than clocks and calendars. You may notice that memories arise that do not belong neatly to the past. There are flashes of familiarity connected to experiences you have not yet lived, and instead of fear, there is a strange tenderness in them. It feels like remembering a place you have never visited, yet somehow know intimately. A quiet nostalgia appears, not for what has been, but for what is coming, as though a future version of you is gently reaching backward through awareness, reminding you of a path you are already walking. This can be unsettling at first, especially if you have spent most of your life anchored in schedules, deadlines, and the belief that time is something you must manage or outrun. But this experience is not confusion, and it is certainly not dysfunction. It is consciousness beginning to loosen itself from the rigid architecture of three-dimensional time, where past, present, and future are treated as separate rooms with locked doors between them. In truth, time has always been more fluid than we were taught to believe. Linear time is not a law of the universe, but a tool of perception, a framework the human mind uses to create continuity and safety. It helps the nervous system feel oriented, and it helps the ego believe it is in control. But as awareness deepens, that framework starts to soften, because it is no longer needed in the same way. You may notice that the present moment feels fuller now, thicker somehow, as if more information is available inside a single breath than there used to be in an entire day. When you are truly here, not rehearsing the past or negotiating with the future, there is a sense that nothing is missing. And from that fullness, time loses its authority. It stops commanding you and starts responding to you. This shift often comes after long periods of struggle, grief, or exhaustion. It tends to arrive not when life is easy, but when you have tried everything else and finally loosened your grip. When the old strategies of pushing, fixing, and planning stop producing peace, awareness quietly steps forward and says, there is another way to move through this. As time becomes less linear, you may also notice that healing begins to happen in unexpected directions. Moments from the past resurface, not to reopen wounds, but to complete them. You see old memories with new eyes, and what once felt heavy now feels neutral, even instructive. This is not because the past has changed, but because you have. And as you shift, the meaning of the past reorganizes itself around your new level of awareness. At the same time, your relationship with the future changes. Instead of anxiety or urgency, there is a gentle pull, like a tide that does not rush the shore but is completely certain of its arrival. You may feel guided without knowing why, drawn towards certain choices, people, or directions that do not make logical sense, yet feel unmistakably right. This is not wishful thinking. It is coherence forming between your inner state and the larger field of possibility. When consciousness loosens from linear time, it also loosens from the belief that everything must be earned through struggle. You begin to understand, not intellectually but experientially, that life unfolds through alignment, more than effort. The more you relax into presence, the more life seems to meet you halfway, sometimes even more than halfway, as though it had been waiting for you to stop forcing it. This does not mean you stop acting or making decisions. It means action arises from clarity rather than fear. Decisions no longer feel like battles between options, but responses to what is already unfolding. There is less mental noise, less second-guessing, and more quiet certainty. Not the loud confidence of the ego, but the calm assurance of someone who knows they do not need to rush to arrive anywhere. You may also notice that your tolerance for artificial urgency diminishes. Deadlines that once controlled your nervous system lose their emotional charge. You still show up, you still care, but you no longer sacrifice your inner stability to the illusion that everything must happen immediately. You sense, perhaps for the first time, that life has its own intelligence, and that intelligence is not late. As this awareness stabilizes, time begins to feel more like a landscape than a line. You move through it with curiosity instead of pressure. You understand that certain seasons require patience, others require action, and neither can be rushed without consequence. You stop asking when things will happen and start noticing how they are unfolding. This is one of the quiet gifts of stepping beyond three-dimensional time. You realize that the present moment is not a narrow slice between past and future, but a doorway that contains them both. When you are fully present, you are not disconnected from what has been or what will be. You are simply no longer trapped by them. And perhaps the most healing part of this shift is the relief it brings to your sense of self. You stop defining yourself by timelines, milestones, or expectations you once believed you had failed to meet. You see that nothing was wasted. Every delay, every detour, every pause had its own intelligence, shaping you into someone capable of holding this level of awareness. You understand now that awakening does not pull you out of time. It teaches you how to move within it without being owned by it. Like a river that no longer fights the current, you flow with what is, trusting that where you are is not an accident, and where you are going does not need to be forced. And in that trust, something remarkable happens. Life begins to feel less like a race and more like a conversation. Not one you have to dominate or control, but one you are finally quiet enough to hear. 2. You can no longer tolerate superficiality. There comes a quiet but unmistakable moment when conversations that once felt harmless begin to drain you in a way that is difficult to explain. It is not that people have changed, and it is not that you have suddenly become judgmental or withdrawn. It is something subtler than that. Small talk, the polite exchange of words that circle safely around the surface of life, starts to feel heavy, almost physically uncomfortable, as though your body knows before your mind does that something essential is missing. You may notice it in ordinary places: a casual gathering, a familiar workplace conversation, a well-meaning interaction that stays focused on appearances, opinions, or repetitive stories that never quite touch truth. On the outside, nothing is wrong. Everyone is smiling. The words are appropriate. But inside you, there is a quiet fatigue, a sense of depletion that arrives quickly and lingers longer than it used to. This is not because you believe yourself to be above anyone else. In fact, if you look honestly, you may find the opposite is true. There is often a tenderness here, even a humility, because you remember how long you lived in those same conversations, how much energy you once spent maintaining them, and how necessary they were at that stage of your life. You are not rejecting people. You are simply no longer able to meet them at a frequency that no longer resonates with who you are becoming. As consciousness deepens, It develops a kind of honesty that cannot be forced or negotiated. Your nervous system stops pretending. Your body stops cooperating with interactions that require you to fragment yourself or dim your awareness just to fit in. And so what once felt neutral now feels exhausting. Not because it is bad, but because it is incomplete. Small talk becomes heavy not because it lacks value, but because it lacks depth. It stays in the realm of habit, repetition, and social performance, while something inside you is quietly longing for presence, for meaning, for the kind of exchange where two people are not just talking, but actually meeting. And when that longing is not met, your energy recedes, not in protest, but in self-preservation. This shift can feel isolating if you do not understand it. You may wonder why you feel tired around people you care about, or why gatherings that once energized you now leave you feeling hollow. You might even question yourself, asking whether you are becoming antisocial, rigid, or overly sensitive. But this is not a flaw in your character. It is a sign that your awareness has matured beyond the need for constant stimulation. At this stage, your consciousness is no longer satisfied with noise. It is drawn toward resonance. You are not looking for more words. You are looking for truth. Not truth as an argument or a belief, but truth as something felt, shared, and recognized in the space between two people who are willing to be real. You may find that silence feels more nourishing than conversation, not because you have nothing to say, but because silence now carries more information than words that are disconnected from presence. In silence, there is no performance to maintain, no identity to protect, no need to prove or explain. There is simply being, and that is where your energy naturally restores itself. This is also why forced enthusiasm begins to feel unbearable, laughing at things that do not feel funny, agreeing with opinions you no longer hold, participating in conversations that require you to leave your center. Your system knows the cost of that now, and it is no longer willing to pay it. What once felt like politeness now feels like self-betrayal, even if only in small, subtle ways. As a result, you may speak less, but with more care. When you do engage, your words carry weight, not because you are trying to be profound, but because they come from a place of alignment. You begin to notice that fewer conversations feel more nourishing than many shallow ones ever did. Quality replaces quantity, not as a strategy, but as a natural consequence of awareness. This change often reshapes relationships. Some people drift away without conflict, others remain, but the dynamic shifts. There may be moments of misunderstanding, where people interpret your quietness as distance or disinterest. But if you look closely, you will see that you are not withdrawing from connection. You are withdrawing from fragmentation. Your consciousness no longer wants to split itself into pieces to meet expectations. It wants to arrive whole. And arriving whole means you can no longer participate in exchanges that ask you to leave parts of yourself behind. This is not a rejection of the world. It is an invitation to meet it more honestly, to speak when there is something true to say, to listen when listening is genuine, to rest when rest is needed, and to trust that depth will recognize depth, even if it takes time. As this settles, you may find that new forms of connection begin to appear. Fewer, perhaps, but richer. Conversations where pauses are allowed, where vulnerability is not rushed, where presence matters more than cleverness. These connections do not demand energy, they generate it. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to offer yourself the same depth you are seeking from others. You stop distracting yourself with constant input. You allow your own inner world to speak. You listen to your thoughts without immediately judging or fixing them. You sit with emotions long enough to understand what they are asking for. In doing so, you discover that the intolerance for superficiality is not about others at all. It is about an inner alignment that no longer allows you to live on the surface of your own life. You are being called inward, not to escape the world, but to meet it from a deeper place. And when you honor that call, something softens. The exhaustion eases. The need to explain fades. You realize that it is not your job to pull depth out of every interaction. It is simply your responsibility to remain true to your own frequency and trust that whatever is meant to meet you there will, in its own time. This is not becoming distant. This is becoming real. 3. Relationships begin to fall away naturally. There is a phase in inner transformation that feels quieter than people expect, yet carries a weight that is deeply emotional. Relationships begin to loosen, not through arguments, not through dramatic endings, and not through betrayal or conflict, but through something far more subtle. The energy simply is no longer there. Conversations grow shorter. Invitations feel heavier. The effort required to maintain certain connections starts to outweigh the nourishment they provide. Nothing explodes. Nothing collapses. Things just stop moving forward. This can be confusing, especially if you were taught that meaningful relationships must be fought for, explained, repaired, or held together at all costs. You may look around and wonder why nothing is technically wrong, yet everything feels finished. There is no clear reason to point to, no single moment you can blame, just a quiet knowing that continuing would require you to spend energy you no longer have. This is not avoidance, this is not coldness, and it is not a failure of love. It is refinement. When consciousness shifts, it does not only change how you think, it changes how energy flows through your life. And relationships, more than almost anything else, are exchanges of energy. When two people are aligned in rhythm, connection feels effortless. When that rhythm changes for one but not the other, the relationship does not become wrong, but it does become heavier. At earlier stages of life, you may have had the capacity to carry that weight. You could explain yourself repeatedly. You could compromise parts of your truth. You could adjust your tone, soften your edges, hide your questions, and suppress your depth in order to keep peace. And for a time, that worked. It was necessary. It helped you survive, belong, and feel anchored in the world. But at this stage, your system no longer has the surplus energy required to maintain misalignment. This is often the most painful part to accept, because many of the relationships that begin to fade were not unhealthy. They were kind, familiar, supportive in their own way. And that is what makes this phase so tender. You are not walking away from something toxic. You are releasing something complete. The mind wants a story here. It wants to label, analyze, and justify. It wants a reason that sounds respectable, but the truth is simpler and harder to explain. You have changed, not in personality, but in frequency. And the relationship cannot follow you where you are going, not because it is inferior, but because it belongs to a different season. This is why there is no anger, no resentment, no desire to prove a point or make someone wrong. There is often gratitude, mixed with grief. Grief not because something bad happened, but because something meaningful is ending. And grief of this kind is quiet. It does not demand attention. It moves slowly through the body, sometimes showing up as tiredness, sometimes as nostalgia, sometimes as a dull ache when you think of people who once felt central to your life and now feel distant. You may question yourself during this time. You may wonder if you are becoming selfish, distant, or emotionally unavailable. But if you look closely, you will see that the opposite is true. You are becoming more honest. And honesty requires energy. It requires presence. And presence cannot be sustained in environments that ask you to fragment yourself. As awareness deepens, your nervous system becomes less tolerant of inner contradiction. You can no longer say yes when your body says no. You can no longer stay engaged out of obligation while quietly disappearing inside. The cost is simply too high now. And so, instead of dramatic endings, life offers you something gentler: distance, space, natural release. This is how refinement works. Not everything that leaves your life does so because it failed. Some things leave because they succeeded. They taught you what they were meant to teach. They walked with you as long as they could, and then they step aside. Not in rejection, but in completion. What makes this phase especially challenging is that others may not experience the ending the same way you do. From their perspective, nothing has changed. They may not feel the misalignment yet. They may not sense the subtle friction that you feel in your body every time you try to continue as before. And because of that, you may feel guilt. You may feel as though you owe them an explanation that does not exist in words. But energy does not require explanation. You are not obligated to stay where your soul cannot breathe. As these relationships fall away, you may notice a strange emptiness at first. Not loneliness exactly, but space, unstructured time, fewer messages, fewer demands. And this space can feel uncomfortable if you are not used to it. The mind may rush in to fill it, suggesting that something is missing, that you should reconnect, reach out, fix, repair. But if you stay with the space, something else reveals itself. Relief. A quiet relief that you no longer have to perform, translate, or manage yourself in those connections. A relief that allows your shoulders to drop, your breath to deepen, your inner world to become audible again. And in that relief, you begin to recognize that what you lost was not love, but effort. True connection does not require constant maintenance through self-abandonment. As refinement continues, you may find that your circle becomes smaller, but your sense of self becomes larger. You begin to value resonance over history, presence over familiarity, depth over duration. This does not make you disloyal. It makes you aligned. And from that alignment, new connections begin to form. Not immediately, not dramatically, but organically. People who do not require explanation. Conversations that do not drain. Silences that feel safe. These relationships may look simpler from the outside, but they carry a different quality. They meet you where you are, not where you used to be. Perhaps the most important realization in this phase is that release does not require rejection. You can love people without staying in the same energetic exchange. You can honor what was without forcing it to continue. You can carry gratitude without carrying responsibility for what no longer fits. This is not loss. This is clarity. And clarity, though it can feel lonely at first, is what creates space for a life that no longer asks you to shrink, explain, or exhaust yourself in order to belong. What is falling away is not connection. It is misalignment. And what remains, slowly and gently, is truth. 4. You stop seeking validation. There comes a point in inner maturity when the constant urge to explain yourself begins to dissolve. Not because you have become distant or indifferent, but because something far more stable has taken root inside you. You notice that the old reflex to clarify who you are, to justify your choices, or to make sure others understand your intentions no longer arises with the same urgency. It is not suppression. It is not resignation. It is a quiet confidence that does not need witnesses. For a long time, seeking validation was not a flaw. It was a strategy. It helped you survive in a world where belonging often depended on being understood, approved of, or mirrored by others. You learned early that being seen meant safety, and being misunderstood felt like danger. So you explained, you adjusted, you refined your words, your tone, your behavior, hoping that if people could just see you clearly enough, everything would feel easier. But something changes as awareness deepens. You begin to realize that being understood does not always bring peace, and being misunderstood does not always bring harm. In fact, some of the most draining moments of your life may have come from being fully understood by people who still could not meet you where you were. And some of the most peaceful moments may have arrived when no one understood you at all, but you were finally honest with yourself. As this realization settles, the compulsion to correct perceptions weakens. When someone misunderstands you, you may feel a brief flicker of recognition, but it passes quickly. There is no longer a tightening in the chest, no urgent need to set the record straight. You recognize that their perception is shaped by their own experiences, wounds, and level of awareness, and that it is not your responsibility to manage it. This is not emotional withdrawal. It is emotional sovereignty. You stop handing your sense of self to the opinions of others. Not aggressively, not defensively, simply by not doing it anymore. And in that absence of effort, something remarkable happens. Your energy returns to you. When you are no longer scanning the room for approval, you begin to notice how much attention you had been giving away, how often you were checking reactions, adjusting yourself, measuring your worth through subtle cues. Without that constant outward focus, your awareness naturally turns inward, and what you find there is not emptiness, but presence. Being at home within yourself does not feel like pride. It feels like relief. You realize you no longer need to perform your identity. You do not need to summarize your journey, justify your growth, or translate your depth into language that feels acceptable. You are allowed to be complex without explanation. You are allowed to evolve without permission. And most importantly, You are allowed to be misunderstood without collapsing. This does not mean you stop communicating or sharing. It means you speak from truth rather than from need. When you do explain yourself, it comes from generosity, not anxiety, from clarity, not self-defense. And because of that, your words carry a different quality. They are lighter, more grounded, less charged. You may also notice that you become more selective with your energy. Not everyone receives access to your inner world anymore. Not out of fear, but out of discernment. You understand now that intimacy is not measured by how much you reveal, but by how safe it feels to reveal it. And safety is not guaranteed by familiarity or history. It is created through resonance. As validation loses its grip, comparison fades with it. You stop measuring your progress against someone else's timeline. You no longer feel compelled to explain why your path looks different, slower, quieter, or less conventional. You trust that what is unfolding in you is not late or behind, but precise. This trust does not come from certainty about the future. It comes from alignment with the present. You begin to sense when something is right for you without needing external confirmation. There is a bodily knowing, a subtle ease that accompanies aligned choices, even when they do not make sense to others. And when doubt arises, you sit with it instead of outsourcing it. You listen. You wait. You allow clarity to emerge, rather than forcing it through reassurance. In this stage, silence becomes more comfortable than explanation. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer need noise to affirm your existence. Silence feels like a place you can rest, a place where you are not required to be anything other than what you are in that moment. This can be misinterpreted by others. Some may assume you have grown distant or aloof. Some may feel unsettled by your lack of reaction, your refusal to defend yourself, or your calm in situations that once demanded engagement. But this is not withdrawal, it is integration. You have stopped living on the surface of your identity, and with that, a subtle kindness begins to emerge toward yourself. You forgive past versions of you who needed validation, because they did not yet know how to generate safety from within. You see how hard you work to be seen, and you honor that effort without needing to repeat it. There is no shame in having needed approval. There is only growth in no longer depending on it. As this settles, your relationships shift again. You attract fewer people who require constant reassurance and more people who are comfortable with their own inner stability. Conversations deepen not because you demand depth, but because you are no longer willing to stay where depth is not possible. You stop chasing connection and begin allowing it. Perhaps the most profound change is the way you meet yourself in moments of uncertainty. When life feels unclear, you no longer rush to explain it away or seek immediate validation for your feelings. You stay. You breathe. You trust that understanding will come in its own time, not as a concept, but as a felt sense. Being at home within yourself does not mean you have all the answers. It means you are no longer afraid of the questions. And in that quiet courage, you discover something simple and enduring. You do not need to be understood by everyone to live truthfully. You do not need permission to be whole. You do not need validation to belong to your own life. You are already here, and that is enough. 5. Your body is changing. There is a moment in this inner shift when you realize that what is happening is not limited to thoughts, beliefs, or emotions. Something deeper is involved. Your body, the quiet companion that has carried you through every season of your life, begins to speak more clearly. Sensations appear that you may not have words for at first. Heat moves through your chest or spine. A gentle pressure forms behind the eyes. A vibration hums beneath the skin. There may be tingling in the hands, heaviness in the limbs, or a sudden wave of fatigue that arrives without warning. The instinctive response is often concern. The mind searches for explanations, diagnoses, labels, but if you listen carefully, without panic and without rushing to conclusions, you may notice that these sensations do not carry the signature of illness. They do not feel threatening. They feel unfamiliar, yes, but also purposeful, as if your system is learning something new. This is not pathology. This is adaptation. For most of your life, your nervous system was trained for vigilance. It learned how to scan for danger, how to stay alert, how to brace against uncertainty. That mode was not wrong. It was necessary. It kept you functioning in environments that demanded constant readiness. But as awareness expands, that same mode becomes inefficient. The body begins to reorganize itself around a different baseline, one that is less reactive and more receptive. You may notice that you are more sensitive to your surroundings now. Spaces that once felt neutral suddenly feel overwhelming or draining. Crowded rooms exhaust you more quickly. Loud noises linger in your system longer. Certain lighting, certain textures, even certain smells register more strongly than before. This is not weakness. It is sensitivity returning after years of being suppressed. The same is true with food. You may find that meals you once enjoyed now leave you feeling heavy, foggy, or unsettled. Other foods suddenly feel nourishing in a way you cannot quite explain. Your body is not following trends or rules. It is responding to what supports clarity and what disrupts it. Appetite becomes information rather than impulse. You may also notice changes in how you experience other people's energy. Being around someone who is anxious, angry, or disconnected may leave you feeling tired or tense, even if they say all the right things. On the other hand, a calm presence can feel deeply regulating, almost medicinal. Your system is becoming more attuned to coherence and more resistant to incoherence, not out of judgment, but out of self-regulation. These changes can be unsettling if you are not prepared for them. You may wonder why your tolerance has decreased, why you need more rest, why your body demands simplicity where it once tolerated excess. But this is not regression. It is refinement. As consciousness expands, the body must recalibrate to hold it. Just as a higher voltage requires stronger wiring, greater awareness requires a nervous system capable of supporting it. Old patterns of tension begin to release. Muscles soften where they were once chronically tight. Breathing deepens. Sleep cycles shift. Sometimes rest becomes unpredictable. Not because something is wrong, but because integration is happening beneath the surface. During this phase, you may feel called to slow down in ways that challenge old beliefs about productivity and worth. Rest may feel necessary rather than optional. Movement may need to be gentler, more intuitive. Stillness, once uncomfortable, begins to feel restorative. This is not laziness. It is intelligence. The body does not evolve through force. It evolves through listening. When unusual sensations arise, the most supportive response is curiosity rather than fear. Instead of asking what is wrong, you might ask what is changing. Instead of resisting discomfort, you allow it to move, trusting that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The more you soften around these experiences, the more smoothly they integrate. This phase also invites a new relationship with control. You cannot think your body into transformation. You cannot will it to stabilize faster. The nervous system learns through safety, not pressure. When you offer yourself patience, hydration, nourishment, and kindness, you create the conditions for regulation to emerge naturally. It can help to remember that your body is not separate from your awareness. It is awareness made tangible. Every cell is responsive to the state of consciousness you inhabit most often. When you live in chronic stress, the body adapts to stress. When you begin to live in presence, the body must relearn how to rest, receive, and repair. This relearning takes time. There may be days when you feel deeply embodied, grounded, and clear. There may be other days when fatigue or sensitivity surprises you. Both are part of the same process. Progress here is not linear. It unfolds in waves, much like the sensations themselves. As you become more attuned, you may also notice an increased capacity for pleasure, for subtle enjoyment, for simple moments of comfort. Warmth feels warmer. Quiet feels richer. A slow breath feels meaningful. These are signs that your system is moving out of survival and into presence. The most important thing during this stage is trust. Trust that your body knows what it is doing. Trust that it is not betraying you, but supporting a deeper integration of awareness. And trust that you do not need to rush or fix what is already unfolding with intelligence. You are not becoming fragile. You are becoming refined. Your body is learning how to hold more consciousness without bracing against it. And as that learning continues, the strange sensations give way to a new sense of coherence, one that feels less like effort and more like home. This is not a breakdown. This is a reorganization, and if you listen gently, Without forcing meaning onto every sensation, your body will guide you, one quiet adjustment at a time, into a way of being that feels both grounded and awake. 6. You realize the fifth dimension is not a place to escape to. There is a quiet clarity that arrives when you finally understand that this shift in awareness is not an exit from life, not an escape hatch from responsibility, pain, or human complexity, but an invitation to live this very life from a different center. For a long time, spirituality may have felt like a way out, a promise that someday things would lift you above the messiness of being human, above uncertainty, conflict, and effort. But as awareness matures, that illusion gently dissolves, and what replaces it is something far more grounded and honest. You begin to see that the fifth dimension is not elsewhere. It is not above you or beyond you. It is not a destination you reach after enough healing, enough understanding, or enough discipline. It is a shift in orientation, a movement from living life as a problem to be solved into living life as an experience to be met. Nothing disappears. Everything remains. But the way you stand inside it changes. At earlier stages, much of your energy went into survival. Even if your life looked stable from the outside, you survived emotionally by managing perceptions, by anticipating reactions, by staying alert to what might go wrong. You survived psychologically by building stories about who you needed to be and what you needed to achieve in order to feel safe. You survived relationally by adjusting yourself to fit the expectations around you. That mode of living was not wrong. It was intelligent. It got you through what you needed to get through. But survival is not meant to be a permanent home. When awareness deepens, you begin to feel the exhaustion of living in constant preparation. You notice how much of your attention has been pulled into the future, into rehearsals of what might happen, what could go wrong, or what you should become. You realize that even moments of success were often overshadowed by the next concern, the next goal, the next thing to manage. And quietly, without drama, something inside you says that this cannot be the whole story. Living from presence does not remove challenges. It changes your relationship to them. You still face decisions, loss, uncertainty, and effort, but they no longer define you. They no longer feel like evidence that something is wrong with you or your path. Instead, they become information, part of the dialogue between you and life, offering insight rather than punishment. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of the fifth dimension. It is often imagined as a state where nothing hurts and everything flows effortlessly. But that is not truth. The deeper truth is that when you are present, pain does not have to become suffering. Difficulty does not have to become identity. You feel what you feel, fully and honestly, without adding the extra layer of resistance that once drained so much of your energy. Presence does not make you passive. It makes you responsive. You act, but your actions are no longer driven by fear of the future or regret about the past. They arise from what is actually happening now. This is what it means to live from a different center. The center is no longer the anxious mind trying to control outcomes. It is awareness itself, steady, observant, and quietly intelligent. You may notice that when you live this way, life becomes simpler, not because there is less to do, but because there is less internal noise around what you are doing. You no longer need every action to justify your existence. You no longer measure your worth by productivity or outcomes. You do what is in front of you because it is in front of you, and you rest when rest is needed, without guilt or explanation. This shift often brings a surprising sense of responsibility, not the heavy kind you carried before, but a grounded responsibility rooted in clarity. You realize that being present means you can no longer blame circumstances, people, or timing for how you show up. You are here now, and how you meet this moment matters, not because you are being judged, but because your state of awareness shapes the quality of your experience. Living from presence also changes how you engage with the world. You are no longer trying to escape it, improve it aggressively, or withdraw from it in disappointment. You meet it, you listen, you respond. You recognize when something requires action and when it requires patience. You understand that forcing movement where stillness is needed only creates friction, and avoiding action when clarity calls for it only creates stagnation. This is the balance the fifth dimension invites you into. Not withdrawal from humanity, and not entanglement with it, but conscious participation. You are in the world, but you are no longer consumed by it. You are engaged, but not reactive. You care, but you are not attached in the way you once were, where attachment meant losing yourself. As this way of living stabilizes, you may notice that fear loses much of its authority. It still appears, but it no longer dictates. You recognize fear as a signal rather than a command, something to be felt and understood rather than obeyed. This gives you a quiet courage, not the loud bravery of confrontation, but the steady courage of presence, the ability to stay with what is uncomfortable without collapsing or running. Perhaps the most profound change is that you stop waiting for life to begin. You realize that there is no future moment when you will finally be ready, healed enough, or wise enough to live fully. Life is not waiting on the other side of understanding. It is happening now, in this breath, in this body, in this imperfect moment. This realization can be both humbling and liberating. It humbles the part of you that believed awakening meant leaving the human experience behind, and it liberates the part of you that has always wanted permission to be fully here, fully alive, without apology. Living from presence does not make life smaller. It makes it more intimate. Ordinary moments carry more weight. Simple interactions feel more real. You begin to sense meaning not as something to be found later, but as something that reveals itself when you are paying attention. This is what it means to live in the fifth dimension, not floating above life, but standing firmly inside it, awake, grounded, and available. You are no longer living to survive, to prove, or to escape. You are living to experience, to respond, and to participate consciously in what is unfolding. And in that participation, something settles. You stop asking where you should be, and you begin to feel that where you are is enough to begin. 7. You begin to observe emotions instead of being carried away by them. There is a subtle yet profound shift that happens when you realize that emotions are no longer the authority they once seemed to be. They still arrive, sometimes gently, sometimes with intensity, but they no longer take the steering wheel the moment they appear. You feel them fully, honestly, without pretending they are not there. Yet something inside you remains steady, watching rather than drowning. This is not emotional suppression. It is emotional maturity. For much of your life, emotions may have felt like forces that happened to you, rather than experiences that moved through you. Anger pulled you into reaction. Fear narrowed your vision. Sadness slowed everything down. Joy lifted you up and made you afraid of losing it. Each emotion arrived with a story, and the story often became more powerful than the moment itself. You did not just feel, you became what you felt. But as awareness deepens, a small space begins to open. At first, it is almost unnoticeable. A pause between a thought and a response. A breath before words come out. A moment where you realize you are feeling something without immediately acting on it. This space is not empty. It is alive. And within it, freedom begins to grow. You may notice this most clearly in situations that once triggered you automatically. A comment that would have sent you spiraling now lands, registers, and then passes. Not because it did not matter, but because you no longer collapse into it. You feel the emotional wave rise, crest, and fall, and you remain present throughout the entire movement. The emotion happens, but it does not own you. This shift can feel strange at first, even unsettling. You might wonder if you are becoming detached or numb, but if you look closely, you will see that the opposite is true. You are actually feeling more, not less. The difference is that you are no longer confusing emotion with identity. You are no longer saying, "I am angry, I am afraid, I am broken." Instead, there is a quieter recognition. Anger is here. Fear is moving through. Sadness is present. That distinction changes everything. When emotions are no longer fused with who you believe yourself to be, they lose their power to define your reality. They become information rather than commands, signals rather than verdicts. You listen to them, but you do not obey them blindly. You allow them to speak, but you do not let them make decisions for you. Between stimulus and response, a stillness appears. This stillness is not cold. It is not distant. It is deeply compassionate. It allows you to meet your inner experience without judgment, without urgency, and without the need to fix or explain it immediately. You realize that emotions do not require resolution the moment they arise. They require presence. When they are met with attention rather than resistance, they complete themselves naturally. You may notice that this changes how you relate to difficult emotions. Fear no longer feels like an enemy. It becomes a messenger, pointing to something that needs care rather than control. Sadness becomes a doorway to softness instead of something to avoid. Even anger, when observed rather than acted out, reveals boundaries that were crossed or needs that were ignored. This observation does not make you passive. It makes you precise. You stop reacting out of habit and start responding out of clarity. You notice that when you wait, even briefly, the most honest response often arises on its own, not from thinking, but from alignment. You speak when there is something true to say. You remain silent when silence is wiser. You act when action feels clean, not rushed or defensive. As this capacity grows, emotional storms lose their drama. They still have energy, but they no longer have chaos. You stop fearing your inner world because you trust your ability to stay with it. This trust is built slowly, through experience, as you realize again and again that no emotion has ever destroyed you. They have moved through you before, and they will move through you again. One of the most healing aspects of this shift is how it changes your relationship with others. When you are no longer ruled by your own emotional reactions, you are less reactive to the emotions of those around you. You stop absorbing moods that are not yours. You stop taking things personally that were never about you. You begin to see emotional expressions in others as reflections of their inner state, rather than attacks or demands. This does not mean you tolerate harmful behavior. It means you respond to it without losing yourself. Boundaries become clearer, calmer, and more consistent. You do not need to raise your voice to be firm. You do not need to shut down to protect yourself. Your presence becomes the boundary. There is also a deep compassion that emerges toward your past. You look back at moments when emotions overwhelmed you, when you reacted in ways you now wish you had not. And instead of shame, there is understanding. You see that you were doing the best you could with the level of awareness you had at the time. You forgive yourself, not as a concept, but as a felt release. As observation becomes more natural, you may notice that joy changes as well. It becomes quieter, steadier, less dependent on circumstances. You no longer cling to good feelings out of fear that they will disappear. You enjoy them while they are here and let them go when they move on. This creates a kind of emotional balance that feels deeply grounding. Life does not feel flat. It feels spacious. And in that spaciousness, you begin to recognize the deeper truth. Emotions are not obstacles on the path of awakening. They are part of it. They are movements of energy, asking to be seen, felt, and integrated. When you stop fighting them and stop identifying with them, they become allies rather than adversaries. This is what emotional intelligence looks like at a deeper level. Not control, not suppression, but relationship. You are in relationship with your inner world now. You listen, you respond, you allow. And because of that, your inner landscape becomes less volatile and more coherent. You trust yourself to handle whatever arises, not because you are strong, but because you are present. And presence, once established, changes the way everything moves. You are no longer carried away by emotional currents. You are learning how to stand in the river and feel the water without losing your footing. 8. Synchronicity begins to appear more often. There is a stage in this inner unfolding when life starts speaking back to you in a quieter but unmistakable language, not through dramatic events or sudden miracles, but through subtle alignments that feel intimate, almost personal. You notice numbers repeating at moments that catch your attention, not because you are searching for them, but because they seem to arrive when your mind is briefly still. A conversation echoes a thought you were holding privately. A book, a phrase, or a sentence appears at the exact moment you needed clarity. Not earlier and not later, but precisely when you were ready to receive it. This can be confusing at first, especially if you were taught to separate inner experience from outer reality. The rational mind wants to dismiss these moments as coincidence, while another part of you recognizes a deeper order, quietly revealing itself. You are not imagining these connections, and you are not being singled out by fate. What is happening is simpler and far more grounded than the stories often built around it. This is not magic. This is resonance. When your awareness begins to settle into presence, the signal you are broadcasting into life changes. For a long time, much of your energy may have been scattered, divided between worry about the future, regret about the past, and constant mental commentary about what should be different. In that state, life feels chaotic, unpredictable, and often indifferent. But as attention gathers itself, as your inner world becomes more coherent, the outer world begins to respond in kind. Synchronicity is not something you attract through effort. It is something you notice when resistance softens. You are no longer pushing against reality, demanding answers or outcomes. You are listening, and when you listen, patterns become visible, not because they suddenly appeared, but because you are finally still enough to see them. Repeated numbers are one expression of this, not because the numbers themselves hold power, but because they catch your awareness at moments of alignment. They function like punctuation marks in the flow of experience, small reminders that you are present, attentive, and engaged. The meaning is not in the symbol. It is in the moment of recognition. The same is true when conversations reflect your inner thoughts. You may find yourself thinking about a question, a fear, or a possibility, and then hearing those same words echoed by someone else, spoken casually, without knowing what has been moving inside you. This is not because your thoughts are controlling others. It is because you are tuning into a shared field of awareness where information circulates more freely than we were taught to believe. As coherence increases within you, your sensitivity to this field increases as well. Books arriving at the right time often carry the same feeling. You may have passed them on shelves for years without interest, and then suddenly one appears, recommended, gifted, or noticed, containing exactly the language you needed to articulate something you were already sensing. This does not mean the book holds truth you lacked. It means you were ready to recognize truth you already carried. At this stage, it becomes important to stay grounded. Synchronicity is not a sign of specialness or superiority. It does not mean you are chosen, elevated, or separate from others. It means you are aligned, and alignment is available to anyone willing to listen deeply enough. When people misinterpret synchronicity, they often try to chase it. They look for signs obsessively, assigning meaning to everything, turning awareness into anxiety. But true synchronicity does not require effort. It unfolds naturally when you are relaxed, attentive, and honest with yourself. The moment you try to force it, it recedes, because force disrupts coherence. What changes at this stage is not life itself, but your relationship with it. You stop feeling like a stranger in your own experience. You begin to sense that there is an underlying intelligence moving through events, conversations, and timing, not to control you, but to meet you. This intelligence does not operate on urgency, it operates on readiness. When you are out of alignment, you may notice resistance, delays, and confusion. When you are aligned, things tend to unfold with a subtle ease, even if they are not always comfortable. Synchronicity does not guarantee ease. It guarantees relevance. It brings you what is meaningful for your growth, not what protects you from challenge. This is why synchronicity often appears during times of transition. When you are letting go of old identities, old patterns, or old relationships, the mind may feel uncertain, but awareness is open. And in that openness, life offers small confirmations, not to reassure you, but to orient you. You may notice that these moments feel deeply personal yet strangely impersonal at the same time. They do not inflate the ego. They quiet it. Instead of making you feel important, they make you feel connected. You sense that you are part of something larger, not as a role to perform, but as a presence participating in a living system. This participation changes how you make decisions. You become less reliant on overthinking and more attentive to subtle cues. A sense of ease or contraction in the body becomes more trustworthy than endless analysis. You still think, you still plan, but planning becomes responsive rather than controlling. You allow space for life to answer you. Over time, you may realize that synchronicity increases when you stop asking for signs and start listening for guidance. Guidance does not shout. It whispers. It appears in ordinary moments, in simple interactions, in quiet realizations that land softly and stay. Perhaps the most grounding realization is this: synchronicity does not mean life is arranging itself around you. It means you are arranging yourself around life. You are no longer fighting the current or trying to swim against it. You are learning how to feel the direction of the water and move with it, adjusting your course without panic. This does not remove your agency. It refines it. You act from attunement rather than resistance. As this becomes more familiar, gratitude arises naturally, not as a practice, but as a response. You appreciate these moments not because they prove anything, but because they remind you that you are not separate from the unfolding of your own life. You are inside it, participating, listening, responding. Synchronicity does not promise certainty. It invites trust. Trust not that everything will go your way, but that whatever arrives will be meaningful. Trust that you do not have to control every detail to be supported. Trust that when you are present, life knows how to meet you. And slowly, without announcement, you realize something profound. The world has not become more magical. You have become more coherent. What you are noticing is not a series of signs pointing outward. It is a reflection of alignment forming within. And from that alignment, life responds, not with spectacle, but with quiet precision, one meaningful moment at a time. 9. You no longer feel the need to control outcomes. There is a quiet turning point when the constant pressure to manage life begins to loosen, not because you have given up caring, but because you have finally seen the cost of trying to hold everything together with force. For a long time, control felt like responsibility. It felt like intelligence. It felt like the only way to stay safe in a world that often seemed unpredictable. You planned carefully, anticipated problems, rehearsed conversations, and tried to steer situations toward the results you believed would protect you from pain or disappointment. And for a while, that approach worked well enough. But something changes as awareness deepens. You begin to notice how exhausting it is to live in a constant state of management, how much of your energy is consumed by trying to make sure life unfolds according to your expectations. You see how often control is driven not by clarity, but by fear. Fear of loss, fear of uncertainty, fear of not being enough if things do not go as planned. At this stage, you do not stop caring about your life. You stop gripping it. You may feel this shift first as a subtle reluctance to force decisions. Choices that once felt urgent now invite patience. Situations that once triggered immediate action now ask for listening. You realize that many of the outcomes you tried so hard to control in the past did not actually bring peace, even when you succeeded. And some of the most meaningful moments of your life arrived unplanned, unforced, and entirely outside your strategies. This realization does not come as a philosophy. It comes as a felt truth. You begin to ask a different kind of question. Not what should I do to make this work, but what is trying to move through me right now? That question shifts the center of gravity inside you. Instead of standing against life, trying to direct it from the outside, you turn inward and listen for what wants to emerge from within. This listening is not passive. It is attentive. It requires honesty and patience. You sit with uncertainty longer than you used to, not because you are confused, but because you trust that clarity does not always arrive on command. You allow space for insight to form rather than forcing answers prematurely. And something unexpected happens when you do this. Life begins to feel less resistant. Opportunities arise with less friction. Conversations unfold more naturally. Even challenges, when they appear, feel less personal, less like obstacles you must overcome, and more like information guiding your next step. You begin to sense that there is an intelligence moving through events, one that does not need your micromanagement to function. This does not mean you abandon intention. It means your intentions become quieter and more spacious. Instead of insisting on specific results, you hold a general direction, a felt sense of alignment, and you allow the details to arrange themselves. You learn to distinguish between effort that is aligned and effort that is compensating for fear. Aligned effort feels clean. It does not tighten the body or rush the breath. It arises from a sense of right timing. Compensatory effort feels urgent, pressured, and draining. As you become more attuned, Your body begins to signal the difference clearly. Expansion indicates alignment. Contraction signals control. Letting go of control also changes how you experience uncertainty. Where uncertainty once felt threatening, it now feels open. You realize that not knowing does not mean something is wrong. It means something is still forming. And instead of trying to resolve that discomfort immediately, you stay present with it, allowing it to shape you. This staying is where trust grows. Trust not as blind optimism, but as lived experience. You remember times when things fell apart despite your best efforts, and how those endings eventually led you somewhere more honest. You remember moments when surrender felt terrifying, yet opened doors you could not have planned. These memories begin to outweigh the old belief that control equals safety. As control softens, your relationship with success and failure changes as well. You stop defining yourself by outcomes. You no longer interpret every result as a reflection of your worth or competence. You see outcomes as feedback rather than judgment. This makes you more flexible, more resilient, and paradoxically, more effective. You also notice a shift in how you relate to other people. When you are no longer trying to control outcomes, you stop trying to control others. You listen more. You interfere less. You allow people to be where they are without needing to fix, persuade, or manage them. This does not mean you tolerate harm or abandon boundaries. It means your boundaries come from clarity rather than fear. There is a gentleness that enters your life at this stage, not because life becomes gentle, but because you stop fighting it unnecessarily. You still take action when action is required. You still speak when something needs to be said, but the underlying tone changes. There is less urgency, less tension, less need to force movement. You begin to understand that life is not asking you to control it. It is asking you to cooperate with it. Cooperation requires presence. It requires sensitivity. It requires the willingness to be changed by what you encounter. And this is perhaps the most radical aspect of letting go of control. You allow life to shape you, rather than insisting that you shape life according to a rigid plan. As this way of being stabilizes, you may notice a deep sense of relief settling into your system. Your shoulders drop. Your breath deepens. The constant background noise of worry softens. You feel more available to the moment you are actually in, rather than the one you were trying to reach. And yes, things often do flow more smoothly, not because you have mastered some technique, but because resistance has decreased. When you stop pushing against life, you feel its movement more clearly. You sense when to step forward and when to wait. You recognize that timing is not something you control, but something you align with. Perhaps the most profound change is that you stop asking life to give you what you want, and you start asking what life wants to express through you. That question does not diminish you. It expands you. It connects your personal journey to something larger, something more intelligent than individual preference. In this way, letting go of control is not a loss of power. It is a return of power, power that no longer comes from force, but from coherence. You act when action is true. You rest when rest is needed. You trust that whatever unfolds is part of a conversation you are now able to hear. And in that conversation, you discover that life does not need to be controlled to be meaningful. It needs to be met, honestly, patiently, and with a willingness to be guided rather than driven. What once required effort now requires attention. What once required force now requires presence. And in that presence, life moves, not perfectly, but truthfully, carrying you forward in ways you could never have planned, yet somehow recognize as right. 10. The old ego begins to dissolve. There is a moment of recognition that arrives not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet, irreversible knowing, the kind that settles into your bones and does not ask for permission from the mind. You realize that the voice in your head, the constant stream of commentary, analysis, judgment, and memory, is not who you are. It is something you have been listening to for a very long time, something familiar and persuasive, but not the source of your being. At first, this realization can feel disorienting, because so much of your identity was built around thought. You believed yourself to be your opinions, your interpretations, your internal narratives about what happened and what it meant. You believed yourself to be your past, the collection of experiences that shaped you, wounded you, strengthened you, and defined you in ways both visible and subtle. You believed yourself to be your achievements and your failures, the moments that made you proud and the ones that kept you awake at night replaying what you wish you had done differently. And then, slowly, you begin to see something else. You notice that thoughts come and go, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, sometimes convincing, sometimes absurd, and yet something in you remains unchanged as they pass. You notice that memories arise, vivid and emotional, and then fade, while the awareness watching them remains steady. You notice that feelings of pride and shame move through you like weather, intense at times, fleeting at others, and still, there is a presence beneath them that is not altered by their arrival or departure. This is not an intellectual insight. It is experiential. You do not think your way into this understanding. You notice it, the way you notice the sky when the clouds part for a moment. And once you notice it, you cannot unsee it. You are not your thoughts. You are the awareness in which thoughts appear. You are not your history. You are the consciousness that remembers it. You are not your success or your failure. You are the witness that experienced both and remained. As this recognition deepens, the old ego structure begins to loosen, not because you are attacking it or trying to get rid of it, but because it is no longer needed in the same way. The ego was a useful tool. It helped you navigate the world. It created a sense of continuity, protection, and motivation. It gave you a name, a role, a story you could tell yourself and others about who you were and how you fit. But the ego was never meant to be the ruler of your inner life. When awareness takes its rightful place, the ego does not disappear overnight. It softens. It becomes less dominant, less convincing, less urgent. You still have thoughts, preferences, and opinions, but they no longer feel like absolute truths you must defend. They feel provisional, contextual, and often surprisingly light. This can be unsettling, because the ego thrives on certainty. It wants solid ground, clear definitions, fixed identities. When those begin to dissolve, there may be moments of fear, a sense of groundlessness, as though something essential is slipping away. But if you stay with the experience, if you do not rush to rebuild the old structure, you discover that what is dissolving is not you, but the tension of pretending to be something you were never meant to be. As the ego loosens, your relationship with judgment changes. You judge yourself less harshly, not because you are trying to be kinder, but because judgment no longer makes sense in the same way. When you see yourself as awareness rather than as a fixed identity, mistakes lose their moral weight. They become experiences, information, movements within a much larger field of learning. You stop labeling moments as proof of your worth or lack thereof. Success no longer inflates you. Failure no longer defines you. Both pass through the same open space of awareness, teaching what they are meant to teach, and then moving on. This shift also changes how you relate to others. When you are no longer invested in defending a rigid identity, you feel less threatened by difference. You listen more. You argue less. You do not need to convince others to see the world your way in order to feel secure. You can allow multiple perspectives to exist without collapsing into confusion or superiority. Compassion deepens here, not as an ideal, but as a natural response. When you see that you are not your own thoughts and stories, you begin to recognize that others are not theirs either. You see the fear beneath defensiveness, the pain beneath anger, the longing beneath control. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but it changes how you meet it. You respond with clarity rather than reactivity, with boundaries rather than hostility. There is also a profound relief that comes with the dissolution of the old ego. The effort required to maintain an image, to live up to a story, to constantly evaluate yourself against an internal standard, begins to fall away. You realize how exhausting it was to carry your identity like a fragile object that needed constant protection. And as that effort drops, energy returns to you. You feel more spacious inside, more available, more at ease in your own presence. This does not mean you lose your personality or become passive. You still have preferences. You still care. You still engage with life. But engagement now comes from authenticity rather than performance. You act because something feels true, not because it reinforces a story about who you are supposed to be. As the ego dissolves, time itself can feel different. Without a rigid identity anchored in past and future, the present moment becomes more vivid. You are less preoccupied with how this moment will be remembered or what it will lead to. You are simply here, experiencing what is unfolding, without needing it to justify your existence. Perhaps the most subtle and powerful change is this: you stop trying to fix yourself. When you see that you are awareness itself, the impulse to constantly improve, correct, or optimize your identity begins to fade. Growth still happens, but it happens organically, without self-rejection. You learn, you adapt, you change, but you do not do so from the belief that you are fundamentally lacking. This is the quiet dignity of awakening. You understand that the ego was never the enemy. It was a stage, a necessary phase of development, and like all stages, it was meant to be lived through, not clung to. As it dissolves, what remains is not emptiness, but presence, not confusion, but clarity, not loss, but freedom. You are still here, more here than ever, not as a collection of thoughts, memories, and roles, but as the awareness that has been present through every chapter of your life, silently witnessing, patiently waiting, until you were ready to recognize it as who you have always been. 11. You feel lonely in a very different way. There is a kind of loneliness that arrives quietly, without drama and without despair, and it can be confusing because it does not match the loneliness you may have known before. It is not the ache of being abandoned or the fear of being unseen. It is not the emptiness that comes from lacking connection. In fact, it can arise even when people are physically present, when conversations are happening, when life appears full on the surface. This loneliness feels different because it is not about absence. It is about perception. You begin to notice that fewer people are seeing the world the way you are seeing it now. Not better, not worse, just differently. You sense layers beneath words, motives beneath actions, patterns beneath events. You feel currents moving through moments that others seem to pass by without noticing. And when you try to speak from this place, you often pause, not because you have nothing to say, but because you sense that the language you are using does not land where you hoped it would. This can feel isolating at first. You may find yourself surrounded by familiar faces and yet feel as though you are standing slightly to the side of the experience, present, but not fully mirrored. You listen more than you speak. You observe more than you explain. And sometimes, in the quiet after a conversation ends, there is a tender recognition that the connection you long for is not about proximity or shared history, but about shared awareness. This loneliness does not ask to be fixed. It asks to be understood. In earlier phases of life, loneliness often carried urgency. It demanded distraction, validation, or replacement. You filled it with noise, activity, or attachment, hoping that closeness would erase the discomfort. But this new loneliness does not respond to those strategies. It is not satisfied by being busy. It is not comforted by constant interaction. It remains calm and steady, inviting you to sit with it rather than escape it. When you do, you begin to notice something surprising. This loneliness is spacious. It does not collapse you inward. It opens you outward. There is room in it to breathe, to reflect, to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. It feels less like a wound and more like a clearing, a place where the usual chatter of the world softens enough for something quieter to be heard. This is why it can be called sacred. Sacred does not mean elevated or special. It means set apart. It means different in quality. This loneliness is set apart from despair because it is not rooted in rejection. It is rooted in alignment. You are no longer willing to meet life only on the surface. And until depth recognizes depth, there is an interval where you walk with fewer companions. That interval is not punishment. It is preparation. During this time, you may feel a subtle grief for the ease of earlier connections, for the simplicity of belonging without questioning. You may miss the feeling of blending in, of not having to translate your inner world or hold your tongue. This grief is natural. It honors what was real and meaningful at earlier stages of your life. There is no need to rush through it or dismiss it as weakness. At the same time, something else is forming beneath the grief. a steadiness. As you learn to sit with this sacred loneliness, you begin to discover that you are not as alone as you once believed. You are accompanied by your own presence in a way that feels new. You become more comfortable in your own company, not as a defense, but as a genuine connection. Silence becomes less threatening and more supportive. Time alone becomes restorative rather than empty. This shift changes how you relate to others. You no longer look to people to complete you or to mirror every part of your experience. You meet them where they are, without needing them to confirm your reality. This reduces pressure on relationships and allows them to be what they are, rather than what you need them to be. You may also notice that this loneliness refines your discernment. You become more sensitive to where you belong and where you do not. You no longer force yourself into spaces that require you to dim your awareness or compress your truth. This is not arrogance. It is respect for your inner environment. You are learning that your energy is precious, and that where you place it matters. As a result, connections may become fewer, but when they do appear, they carry a different quality. Conversations feel unhurried. Silences feel comfortable. There is less need to impress or explain. These connections do not rush intimacy. They recognize it quietly, as something that unfolds when both people are present enough to meet. Until those connections arrive, the sacred loneliness remains as a kind of companion. It teaches patience. It teaches trust. It teaches you how to be with yourself without reaching outward for immediate reassurance. And in doing so, it strengthens a foundation that will support deeper relationships when they do come. There is also a humility that grows here. You realize that seeing differently does not make you separate from others. It simply places you at a different vantage point. You remember that everyone is moving at the pace their life requires, and that awareness cannot be forced or hurried. This understanding softens any temptation to withdraw in judgment, or to feel superior in your solitude. You become gentle with the distance. You understand that this phase is not permanent, but it is necessary. Like a pause between breaths, it allows integration to happen. It allows your nervous system to settle into a new baseline. It allows your identity to loosen further, so that when connection returns, it does so without the old dependencies. Perhaps the most important gift of this sacred loneliness is that it teaches you to belong to yourself first, not as an idea, but as an experience. You learn to trust your perceptions without needing immediate agreement. You learn to honor your inner world without needing constant reflection from outside. And from that place of self-belonging, the fear of being alone gradually dissolves. You are not lonely because you are disconnected. You are lonely because you are becoming more whole, and wholeness requires space. In time, life will meet you there, not with crowds or constant affirmation, but with resonant connection. The kind that feels quiet, real, and unforced. Until then, this sacred loneliness holds you, not as an absence, but as a presence, steady and patient, reminding you that you are not missing anything essential. You are simply standing in a wider field now, learning how to inhabit it with grace. 12. You learn to distinguish discernment from judgment. There is a subtle but life-changing refinement that happens when your awareness deepens enough to see clearly without needing to condemn. At earlier stages, seeing often came paired with judgment. When you recognized something as misaligned, the mind rushed in to label it as wrong, inferior, or threatening. Judgment felt like protection. It gave the ego a sense of certainty and control. But over time, you begin to feel the weight of that approach. The quiet exhaustion that comes from constantly categorizing the world into what should stay and what must be rejected. As consciousness matures, that reflex softens. You still see clearly, perhaps more clearly than ever before. In fact, your perception sharpens. You notice energy beneath words. You sense intentions before actions fully form. You recognize patterns in people and situations without needing evidence or explanation. But something important changes. You no longer feel the need to make what you see mean something about anyone's worth, including your own. This is where discernment emerges. Discernment is not emotional. It is not reactive. It does not carry heat or urgency. It is quiet, steady, and grounded in presence. When discernment is active, there is no internal argument. There is simply a knowing. This fits. This does not. This feels aligned. This no longer does. There is no story attached, No moral conclusion. No need to persuade yourself or anyone else. Judgment, on the other hand, is loud. It tightens the body. It accelerates thought. It creates separation, and often comes with an impulse to distance, correct, or defend. Judgment says, "This is wrong and should not exist." Discernment says, "This is not for me," and that is enough. Learning the difference between the two is a mark of inner maturity. You may notice this most clearly in relationships, where you once judged someone for their behavior, beliefs, or level of awareness. You now simply recognize incompatibility. There is less frustration and more clarity. You do not need them to change in order for you to be at peace. You also do not need to stay in situations that drain you out of loyalty or habit. You can step back without resentment, without explanation, and without closing your heart. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you honest. Discernment allows compassion to coexist with boundaries. You can understand why someone behaves the way they do without needing to expose yourself to the impact of that behavior. You can see the wound beneath the action without offering yourself as a place for it to land. This balance is something you could not hold before, not because you were incapable, but because your awareness was still entangled with identity. As the ego dissolves further, you stop needing to define yourself in opposition to others. You no longer require contrast to know who you are. And without that need, judgment loses its function. There is nothing to defend. There is nothing to prove. This shift also changes how you relate to your own inner world. You stop judging your thoughts and emotions for appearing. When fear arises, you do not label yourself weak. When anger surfaces, you do not condemn yourself as unspiritual. You observe these movements with curiosity rather than critique. Discernment shows you what the emotion is pointing to. Judgment would have tried to silence it. Because of this, your inner landscape becomes less hostile and more cooperative. Parts of you that were once pushed away begin to integrate naturally. You do not need to force healing. You simply stop fighting what is asking to be seen. In everyday life, discernment feels like simplicity returning. You make choices without excessive explanation. You leave conversations when your energy drops, without needing a dramatic reason. You say no without rehearsing justifications. You say yes without overthinking future consequences. Life becomes less about managing impressions and more about honoring alignment. Others may notice this change. Some may interpret it as distance or detachment. But what is actually happening is that you are no longer leaking energy through constant evaluation and reaction. You are conserving presence. And presence, once stabilized, does not require commentary. There is also a gentleness that accompanies discernment. Because you are no longer judging, you are less reactive to difference. You do not need to convince others to see what you see. You understand that awareness unfolds at its own pace, shaped by experience, readiness, and necessity. This understanding brings patience. It allows you to coexist with a wide range of perspectives without losing yourself. Judgment seeks to narrow the world. Discernment allows it to be wide. This does not mean you become permissive or unclear. In fact, clarity increases. Your boundaries become more consistent because they are not fueled by emotion. They are fueled by truth. You do not wait until something becomes unbearable to step away. You sense misalignment earlier and respond with less drama. One of the most liberating aspects of this shift is how it frees you from internal conflict. When you no longer judge, you stop arguing with reality. You accept what is present without agreeing with it, without absorbing it, and without needing to change it. Acceptance here does not mean approval. It means accuracy. You see what is, and you respond accordingly. This response may be action. It may be distance. It may be silence. It may be engagement. But it is clean. It does not leave residue. You do not replay the interaction later, wishing you had said something different. You trust the clarity that guided you in the moment. Over time, discernment becomes less something you practice and more something you embody. It informs how you choose environments, how you structure your days, how you invest your attention. You begin to notice that life itself seems to support this way of being. Situations that once demanded judgment simply fade from relevance. Choices become simpler because your values are lived rather than debated. Perhaps the deepest gift of discernment is the peace it brings. You stop carrying the burden of fixing the world in order to feel safe within it. You recognize that your responsibility is not to judge what exists, but to choose where you stand, where you offer your energy, and where you do not. You are no longer trying to make life conform to an ideal. You are meeting life as it is, from a place of clarity, and in that clarity, a simple truth settles in. You do not need to label something as wrong in order to walk away from it. You do not need to judge something as lesser in order to choose differently. You only need to listen to what resonates and honor what does not. This is discernment. Quiet, clean, compassionate. And once you learn to trust it, you move through the world with less resistance and more ease, knowing that clarity does not require condemnation, and wisdom does not need to raise its voice. 13. Dreams become more vivid and purposeful. There is a noticeable shift that happens when your inner world begins to open more fully, and one of the clearest places it shows up is in your dreams. They no longer feel random or forgettable, no longer like scattered images created by a tired mind. Instead, they arrive with texture, emotion, and meaning. You wake up with the sense that something was communicated, even if you cannot immediately translate it into words. These dreams are not here to entertain you. They are not stories meant to distract or amuse. They are guidance. When consciousness deepens, it does not stop communicating when the body sleeps. In fact, sleep becomes one of its most honest channels. The thinking mind quiets. The filters soften. The need to control narrative dissolves. And in that openness, awareness speaks in the language it has always preferred. The language of images, symbols, sensations, and feeling tones. You may notice that your dreams feel more vivid than before. Colors appear brighter. Emotions feel stronger. Scenes linger in your body long after you wake. Sometimes a single image stays with you all day, not demanding interpretation, but quietly asking to be felt. Other times, a dream unfolds like a lesson, moving through stages, showing you something about yourself you have not yet fully acknowledged. This does not mean every dream must be analyzed. In fact, trying to dissect them too quickly can pull you back into the old habit of control. These dreams are not puzzles to be solved. They are messages to be received. Often, their meaning reveals itself gradually, through resonance rather than logic. You may dream of places you have never been, yet feel deeply familiar. You may encounter people who do not exist in your waking life, yet carry emotions you recognize instantly. You may find yourself revisiting moments from the past, but seeing them from a different angle, with compassion rather than judgment. Or you may dream of situations that seem to belong to the future, leaving you with a sense of recognition rather than surprise. This is how the deeper layers of consciousness work. They do not follow chronological time. They speak in patterns, metaphors, and emotional truths. A dream might show you where you are holding fear, where you are resisting change, or where you are already more free than you realize. It may not explain itself. It trusts that you will feel what matters. At this stage, dreams often become more instructive because your waking awareness is ready to listen. Earlier in life, the same guidance may have appeared, but it was drowned out by noise, distraction, or disbelief. Now, as your inner world becomes quieter, the signal comes through more clearly. You may also notice that dreams begin to assist with emotional processing. Feelings you did not have time or safety to feel during the day find expression at night. Grief moves through imagery. Fear takes symbolic form. Desires surface without shame. This is not regression. It is integration. Your psyche is completing unfinished conversations. In dreams, you can encounter parts of yourself that were pushed aside in waking life. The child who adapted too early. The anger that was never allowed to speak. The intuition that was ignored. These parts do not show up to accuse you. They show up to be acknowledged. When they are seen, they soften. When they are felt, they release. As dreams become more vivid, you may find that waking life feels more spacious as well. The boundary between sleeping awareness and waking awareness grows thinner. Insights from dreams influence your choices during the day. You respond differently to situations because something was clarified at night, not as a thought, but as a knowing. This does not make you detached from reality. It makes you more rooted in it. Dream guidance does not pull you away from life. It prepares you to meet it more honestly. It shows you where alignment is forming and where resistance remains. It reveals not what you should do, but what is ready to move. One of the most important shifts at this stage is learning to trust the language of images. Modern life trains you to privilege words, logic, and explanation. Dreams remind you that truth does not always arrive verbally. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling in the chest, a recurring symbol, or a scene that carries emotional weight without a clear storyline. When you stop demanding clarity too soon, the dreams deepen. You may also notice that some dreams repeat themes rather than exact content. You may find yourself searching, arriving, losing something, crossing a threshold, or standing at the edge of an unknown space. These themes reflect where you are in your inner journey. They are not predictions, they are reflections. At this stage, it can be helpful to meet dreams with respect rather than urgency. You do not need to record every detail or extract meaning immediately. Simply noticing how a dream made you feel is often enough. Did it leave you calm, unsettled, hopeful, or reflective? That emotional residue is often the message. Dreams also tend to become clearer when you honor your waking intuition. The more you listen during the day, the more coherent the communication becomes at night. Consciousness prefers dialogue. When you ignore it in one state, it finds another. There is also a humility that develops here. You realize that not all guidance comes from effort or planning. Some of it arrives when you stop trying, when you rest, when you let go. Dreams remind you that wisdom is not always active. Sometimes it is receptive. Perhaps the most grounding realization is that these dreams are not signs of something extraordinary happening to you. They are signs of something natural returning. Human awareness has always communicated through dreams. What is new is not the phenomenon, but your readiness to receive it. You are not being given information you lacked. You are being reminded of what you already know, beneath thought. As this process continues, dreams become companions, rather than curiosities. You stop asking what they mean, and start asking what they are showing. You allow them to inform your sense of timing, your emotional honesty, and your relationship with yourself. And slowly, without effort, a deeper trust forms. You trust that even when the mind does not understand, awareness does. You trust that guidance does not need to shout to be true. You trust that when the inner world speaks, it does so with precision. Dreams are not asking you to escape reality. They are helping you inhabit it more fully. They are consciousness speaking in its native tongue, meeting you where you are quiet enough to listen, and guiding you, gently and patiently, toward a life that is lived with greater integrity, presence, and depth. And when you wake from these dreams, you may not always remember every image, but you carry something with you into the day. A subtle orientation, a steadiness, a sense that something has been aligned during the night. That is the work of these dreams. Not spectacle, not distraction, but guidance, delivered softly through the language that reaches you when you are no longer resisting. 14. The shadow is no longer the enemy. There comes a moment in inner work when you realize that the battle you have been fighting was never against darkness, weakness, or ego, but against parts of yourself that learned to hide in order to survive. For a long time, growth may have looked like improvement, purification, or transcendence. You tried to rise above anger, silence fear, outgrow desire, and eliminate the traits that did not fit your image of who you thought you were supposed to become. You believed that awakening meant becoming lighter by cutting away what felt heavy. But something softens when awareness matures. You begin to see that what you called the shadow was not an enemy plotting against your well-being. It was a collection of unmet needs, unexpressed emotions, and disowned instincts that carried intelligence, even when they expressed themselves clumsily. The shadow was not trying to sabotage you. It was trying to be seen. At earlier stages, it made sense to fight it. You were building structure. You were learning boundaries. You needed a sense of control in order to function. Suppression looked like strength because it kept chaos at bay. But suppression always comes with a cost. The energy used to keep parts of yourself locked away does not disappear. It turns inward. It shows up as tension, exhaustion, anxiety, or a vague sense of living below your full capacity. When you stop trying to kill the ego, something unexpected happens. You start listening, not to indulge every impulse or justify every reaction, but to understand what each part is asking for beneath its behavior. Anger may be protecting a boundary that was crossed. Fear may be guarding a wound that was never tended to. Control may be compensating for a time when you felt powerless. Desire may be pointing toward a life force that learned it was unsafe to express itself openly. As you turn toward these parts with curiosity rather than condemnation, the inner landscape changes. The war ends. Not because one side won, but because the misunderstanding dissolved. You realize that the ego was never meant to be destroyed. It was meant to be integrated. It provided structure, identity, and continuity at a time when you needed those things. Now, as awareness expands, its role changes. It no longer needs to dominate. It needs to cooperate. Shadow integration is not dramatic. It is quiet and often humbling. It requires you to admit that some of the qualities you judged in yourself were actually adaptations. You were not weak. You were responding to conditions. You were not broken. You were learning how to stay safe. This recognition brings compassion, not as a moral stance, but as an accurate response to reality. As compassion enters, energy unlocks. The parts of you that were frozen in shame or fear begin to thaw. Emotions that were held tight loosen their grip. You feel more vitality, not because you have added something new, but because you have stopped using so much effort to hold yourself together. The energy that was bound up in self-rejection becomes available for creativity, connection, and presence. This is why integration feels freeing. You stop pretending to be pure. You stop chasing an image of enlightenment that requires constant vigilance. You allow yourself to be complex, contradictory, and human without interpreting those qualities as failures. In doing so, you become more grounded, not less spiritual, because spirituality that cannot hold humanity is incomplete. As shadow work deepens, your reactions change. You still feel emotions, but they move through you with less force. When old patterns arise, you recognize them sooner. Instead of spiraling into self-judgment, you meet them with awareness. You ask what is being activated, what is being protected, what is being remembered. And because you listen, the pattern loses its urgency. Integration does not make you passive. It makes you whole. You become more discerning because you are no longer projecting disowned parts of yourself onto others. What once triggered intense reactions now invites curiosity. You see clearly without needing to blame. You respond without needing to defend. This clarity is not cold. It is spacious. It allows you to hold truth without hostility. There is also a deep relief that comes with no longer needing to maintain a spiritual persona. You stop measuring yourself against ideals. You stop comparing your inner state to someone else's appearance. You accept that growth includes discomfort, regression, and repetition, not as signs of failure, but as natural movements of integration. In this phase, you may grieve the time spent fighting yourself. You may feel tenderness for the younger versions of you who believed they had to be different in order to be loved or safe. This grief is not heavy. It is cleansing. It honors the effort that kept you alive long enough to arrive here. As the shadow is welcomed back into awareness, your sense of identity becomes more fluid. You no longer cling to being good, calm, or evolved. You allow yourself to be honest. This honesty does not make you reckless. It makes you real. And reality, when met without resistance, has a way of settling itself. You may notice that creativity returns in unexpected ways. Playfulness emerges. A sense of humor about your own patterns softens the edges. Life feels less like a test and more like a dialogue. You are no longer trying to pass. You are participating. The most profound shift, perhaps, is the end of inner violence. You stop using force against yourself. You stop demanding that parts of you disappear before you allow yourself peace. You understand that peace is not the reward for perfection. It is the ground from which integration happens. Shadow work is not about becoming someone else. It is about reclaiming what you already are. When the shadow is no longer treated as an enemy, it stops behaving like one. It becomes a source of information, resilience, and depth. The same qualities that once caused trouble become strengths when they are integrated rather than denied. Sensitivity becomes empathy. Intensity becomes focus. Caution becomes wisdom. And energy continues to return. You feel less fragmented, less exhausted, more present in your own body, You trust yourself more because you are no longer hiding from yourself. You know that whatever arises can be met. Nothing needs to be exiled. This does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes honest. You walk forward without armor, not because you are invulnerable, but because you are integrated. You carry your light and your shadow together, not as opposing forces, but as parts of a single, intelligent whole. And in that wholeness, something settles that effort could never achieve. A quiet confidence, a grounded peace, a sense that you no longer need to be at war in order to grow. The shadow was never here to stop you. It was here to bring you home. 15. You begin to live more slowly without becoming lazy. There is a subtle but decisive shift that happens when you realize that slowing down is not the same as giving up. For a long time, speed may have been confused with commitment, and constant activity mistaken for purpose. You learn to measure your value by how much you could do, how quickly you could respond, how efficiently you could move through tasks and responsibilities. Rest, in that framework, felt like a reward you had to earn, or a risk you could not afford to take. As awareness deepens, that framework quietly dissolves. You do not stop caring about life. You stop scattering yourself across it. Living more slowly does not come from avoidance or exhaustion. It comes from clarity. You begin to notice how much energy was being lost to unnecessary effort, to mental noise, to emotional labor that never truly needed to be done. You see how often you were reacting rather than responding, filling space rather than honoring it. And once you see that, your system naturally begins to conserve itself. You start choosing your actions more carefully. Not everything requires your immediate attention. Not every invitation needs to be accepted. Not every thought deserves to be followed. This discernment is not based on fear or withdrawal. It is based on respect for your own limited and precious energy. Slowness, at this stage, becomes intentional. You may notice that your movements change. You walk with more awareness. You eat with more presence. You speak with fewer words, but more truth. Even when your days are full, there is less internal rush. The urgency that once lived in your chest softens, replaced by a steady rhythm that feels sustainable. This is not laziness. It is alignment. When you act from alignment, you need less effort to achieve meaningful results. Tasks that once felt draining now feel manageable because you are no longer fighting yourself to complete them. You are no longer trying to prove something through productivity. You are simply doing what needs to be done, in the way it needs to be done, without the added weight of self-judgment. Silence takes on a new role here. Where silence once felt uncomfortable or unproductive, it now feels essential. You recognize that silence is not empty. It is fertile. It allows insight to surface, emotions to settle, and intuition to speak. In silence, your nervous system resets. Your breath deepens. Your attention returns to the present moment, where life is actually happening. This is why stillness becomes one of the most powerful forms of action. When you stop filling every moment with activity, you create space for clarity to emerge. Decisions become simpler. Priorities reorganize themselves without force. You realize that many of the things you thought you had to do were never truly necessary. They were habits formed in a state of restlessness rather than needs arising from reality. Living slowly also changes your relationship with time. You no longer feel constantly behind. You stop measuring your day by how much you accomplished and start noticing how you experienced it. Presence becomes more valuable than progress. You understand that a day lived with attention, even if little appears to have happened externally, can be deeply fulfilling. This shift often challenges old beliefs about worth. You may notice guilt arise when you rest, when you say no, or when you choose simplicity over busyness. But instead of obeying that guilt, you observe it. You recognize it as an old voice, one that equated exhaustion with value, and you gently choose differently. Over time, that guilt loses its power. As you slow down, you may also find that your creativity returns. Ideas come not from pressure, but from openness. Solutions appear not because you forced them, but because you gave them space. You begin to trust that insight does not need to be chased. It arrives when you are receptive. Relationships shift here as well. You become less available for constant interaction, but more available for real connection. You listen without rushing to respond. You are present without trying to fix. People may feel calmer around you, not because you are doing anything special, but because your pace invites regulation. This is one of the quiet gifts of slowing down. Your nervous system becomes a stabilizing presence. You do not need to teach anyone how to calm themselves. Your way of being does it naturally. Living slowly also brings you into deeper contact with your body. You notice subtle signals sooner. Fatigue is acknowledged before it becomes burnout. Tension is released before it becomes pain. Hunger, rest, and movement are honored as forms of intelligence rather than inconveniences. This responsiveness allows your system to function with less strain. You may still have days of activity, moments of intensity, periods of focus. Slowness does not eliminate effort. It contextualizes it. You work when work is needed. You rest when rest is called for. There is less conflict between the two because you no longer see rest as an obstacle to productivity. Perhaps the most profound change is the way you relate to the present moment. When you slow down, you are no longer trying to escape what is happening now in order to arrive at something better later. You meet this moment as sufficient, not perfect, not ideal, but enough to be fully inhabited. In this way, slowness becomes a form of trust. Trust that you do not need to rush to be worthy. Trust that life is not leaving you behind. Trust that what is meant for you does not require constant chasing. You begin to understand that many of the things you were afraid of losing by slowing down were never truly supporting you in the first place. What remains is simpler, but it is also truer. Silence becomes strength. Presence becomes productivity. Stillness becomes movement of the deepest kind. And in living more slowly, without laziness or avoidance, you discover a rhythm that carries you forward without depletion, a rhythm that honors your humanity, a rhythm that allows life to unfold with intelligence rather than force. This is not retreat from life. It is a return to it. You are no longer rushing to arrive somewhere else. You are learning how to be here, fully, and in doing so, you realize that this has always been the most powerful way to move. 16. You realize that time is only a tool of consciousness. There is a deep settling that happens when you finally see that time is not the master you once believed it to be, but a function of awareness itself, a useful instrument rather than an absolute authority. For most of your life, time felt external, something that moved independently of you, something you were always chasing or falling behind. You learned to organize your identity around timelines, milestones, deadlines, and memories, believing that meaning lived somewhere ahead or behind the moment you were in. As awareness matures, that belief begins to soften. You notice that when you are fully present, truly present, without narrating the experience or measuring it against what came before or what should come next, time behaves differently. Moments feel fuller. A single breath contains more reality than an entire day once did. You are no longer rushing through the present in order to reach something else. You are inhabiting it. And in that inhabiting, something profound becomes clear. The present moment is not a thin slice between past and future. It is a meeting point. It is where all timelines intersect. This is not a poetic idea. It is a lived experience. When you are present, memories lose their grip. They still exist, but they no longer pull you backward with emotional force. The future still has form, but it no longer demands your attention through anxiety or urgency. Both past and future become available as information rather than as identity. You can access them without being trapped inside them. This is what it means to touch all timelines at once. Your attention becomes the steering mechanism. Where you place it determines which aspect of reality becomes active. When attention is scattered, life feels fragmented. When attention is anchored in presence, life organizes itself around that coherence. You are no longer being carried by time. You are moving with it, aware of its flexibility. This realization changes how you experience memory. The past no longer feels fixed. When you revisit an old event from a new state of awareness, its meaning shifts. The facts remain the same, but the emotional charge dissolves. You see what happened without reliving it. Healing occurs not because the past is erased, but because it is no longer frozen. At the same time, your relationship with the future becomes lighter. You stop projecting yourself forward in order to feel safe. You realize that safety does not come from certainty about what will happen, but from presence with what is happening now. From this place, planning becomes practical rather than compulsive. You prepare without obsessing. You act without rushing. Time becomes cooperative rather than adversarial. This shift often reveals how much of your suffering was never about circumstances, but about where your attention was living. When attention was constantly pulled into regret or anticipation, the body lived in tension. When attention returns to the present, the body responds with relief. Breath deepens. Muscles soften. The nervous system recognizes safety. Presence is regulation. You may begin to notice that intuitive timing improves as well. You sense when to speak and when to wait. You feel when action is needed and when stillness will serve better. This is not guesswork. It is attunement. When you are present, you are aligned with the rhythm of life as it is unfolding, not as you fear or hope it will unfold. Living this way does not remove uncertainty. It changes your relationship to it. Uncertainty becomes space rather than threat. It allows creativity. It allows emergence. You no longer need to control the future because you trust your capacity to meet it. This trust is built through experience. You notice that when you respond from presence, outcomes tend to be cleaner, even when they are challenging. There is less regret afterward, less replaying of conversations, less questioning whether you should have acted differently. You know you were there when it mattered. The realization that time is a tool of consciousness also reshapes your sense of urgency. You stop feeling pressured to resolve everything immediately. You understand that some things require duration, not delay, but unfolding. You give processes the time they need without interpreting that time as failure. Patience becomes natural here, not forced. You may also notice that joy becomes less dependent on anticipation. You no longer wait for future conditions to feel alive. Aliveness is available now, in simple experiences, in ordinary moments. This does not make you complacent. It makes you available. When you stop outsourcing fulfillment to the future, the present reveals its depth. This awareness also changes how you experience aging, progress, and growth. You stop measuring your life against an imagined schedule. You see that nothing essential has been missed. Every phase arrived when it was needed. Every delay carried its own intelligence. You are not behind. You are here. Time, in this sense, becomes relational rather than linear. It responds to your state of being. When you rush, it feels scarce. When you are present, it feels abundant. Not because there is more of it, but because you are no longer leaking attention. Attention is the true currency. Where attention goes, life follows. This is why presence is not passive. It is active participation at the deepest level. You are choosing, moment by moment, which timeline you are feeding, which reality you are animating, not through force or visualization, but through where you allow your awareness to rest. As this understanding settles, a quiet responsibility emerges. You realize that you cannot blame time for what you avoid. You cannot blame circumstances for what you are not present to meet. This is not self-criticism. It is empowerment. You are no longer waiting for the right moment. You are recognizing that the right moment is the one you are in. Living this way does not mean you abandon goals or dreams. It means you stop living ahead of yourself. You allow the future to be shaped by the quality of your presence now. And paradoxically, this often brings about the very outcomes you once tried to force. Because life responds to coherence. When attention, intention, and action align in the present, reality organizes itself efficiently. There is less friction, less resistance, less wasted effort. You move forward without dragging the weight of other timelines behind you. Perhaps the most liberating aspect of this realization is the end of the inner race. You stop competing with time. You stop negotiating with it. You stop fearing that it will run out before you arrive. You see that arrival has always been here, waiting for your attention. Time was never the obstacle. Distraction was. And now, as attention returns to the present moment, you recognize the simple, steady truth. You are not moving through time as a helpless passenger. You are participating in it as a conscious presence. You are choosing, with every breath, which reality you inhabit. The steering wheel has always been in your hands. 17. You understand that this is not a destination. There is a deep exhale that comes with the realization that there is no finish line waiting for you somewhere ahead. No final version of yourself that you are supposed to become. No moment when everything settles permanently and you can finally say you are done. For a long time, growth may have felt like a project, something to complete, something that would eventually deliver you into a stable state where uncertainty no longer touched you. But lived experience teaches you something quieter and more honest. Awareness is not a destination. It is a way of living. You begin to see that consciousness does not move in straight lines toward completion. It unfolds. It expands and contracts. It brightens and softens. Some days feel clear, spacious, and deeply aligned, as if everything is flowing effortlessly and meaning is close to the surface. Other days feel heavy, slow, or unclear, as if the light you touched yesterday has dimmed or moved out of reach. At earlier stages, this fluctuation might have frightened you. You may have interpreted darker days as failure, regression, or proof that you were doing something wrong. You may have tried to correct them quickly, searching for practices, explanations, or reassurance to bring yourself back to the brighter state. But with maturity, something shifts. You stop fighting the rhythm. You realize that both states belong. Clarity is not a permanent achievement. Confusion is not a mistake. They are movements within the same living process. Just as the body needs cycles of activity and rest, consciousness needs periods of illumination and integration. The days that feel less clear are often the days when something is rearranging itself beneath the surface. When you stop demanding constant brightness, darkness loses its threat. You learn to recognize that a quiet, inward day does not mean awareness has left you. It means it has turned inward, doing work that does not announce itself. Integration is subtle. It often feels like nothing is happening, when in fact, something essential is settling into place. This understanding brings patience. You stop asking yourself when you will finally arrive and start asking how you can be present with what is here. You understand that awakening is not about reaching a higher state and staying there. It is about developing the capacity to remain honest, kind, and aware across changing inner weather. Some days, presence feels effortless. Some days, it requires gentleness and humility. Both are part of the same path. You also begin to release the pressure to perform your awareness. You no longer need to appear calm, centered, or wise at all times. You allow yourself to be human without interpreting that humanity as a problem. Emotions still arise. Old patterns may surface occasionally. Doubt may visit. And instead of panicking, you recognize these moments as invitations to deepen rather than to retreat. This is one of the most grounding realizations of all. Growth does not eliminate difficulty. It changes how you meet it. You no longer measure your progress by how little you struggle, but by how honestly you respond when struggle appears. You notice that even on difficult days, something has changed. You are less lost inside the experience. There is more space around it, more kindness toward yourself, more trust that this, too, belongs. As this settles, comparison loses its grip. You stop measuring your inner state against someone else's outer appearance. You understand that no one lives in constant clarity, no matter how composed they may seem. Everyone moves through cycles. Everyone integrates at their own pace. Awareness cannot be rushed without distortion. This realization allows you to rest. You stop treating each moment of insight as something you must preserve or protect. You let it inform you, shape you, and then pass naturally, trusting that what is true will return when it is needed. You understand that awareness deepens not by clinging to peak experiences, but by allowing them to sink into the ordinary fabric of daily life. Life itself becomes the practice. You wash dishes, you have conversations, you make mistakes, you begin again. And through it all, awareness is present. Sometimes in the foreground, sometimes in the background, but never truly absent. Even on days that feel dull or disconnected, there is a quiet knowing that you are not back at the beginning. You are simply in a different phase of the same unfolding. This understanding changes how you speak to yourself. The inner dialogue softens. You stop using harsh language to motivate growth. You stop threatening yourself with failure if you do not feel a certain way. Instead, you offer yourself the same patience you would offer someone you deeply respect. You recognize that wisdom does not demand perfection. It invites honesty. As you live from this place, your relationship with the future becomes more relaxed. You are no longer chasing a version of yourself that will finally be enough. You see that enoughness is not something you earn later. It is something you practice now, by allowing each moment to be what it is, without needing it to justify your worth. This does not make you complacent. It makes you sincere. You still grow. You still learn. You still change. But the movement is no longer driven by self-rejection. It is guided by curiosity and care. You allow life to shape you through experience rather than forcing yourself into an ideal. Perhaps the most freeing aspect of this realization is the end of spiritual urgency. You stop trying to get somewhere else in order to be okay. You understand that there is no future version of you that will finally deserve peace. Peace is something you touch when you stop arguing with the moment you are in. On bright days, you enjoy the clarity without clinging. On dim days, you offer yourself kindness without judgment. Both days are valid. Both days are necessary. Awareness is not something you finish. It is something you live. And living awareness means allowing yourself to be in process without turning that process into a problem. It means trusting that even when you feel uncertain, something in you knows how to continue. It means understanding that the path does not lead away from your life, but deeper into it. You are not here to arrive. You are here to participate. And in that participation, with all its light and shadow, clarity and confusion, you discover a simple and enduring truth. There is nothing wrong with where you are, nothing missing from this moment, nothing waiting to be completed before you can belong to your own life. You are already inside the unfolding, and that is enough. Coming home, not going somewhere else. If you have listened this far and feel lighter, it is not because something new was added to you. Nothing was installed. Nothing was upgraded from the outside. What you are feeling is the relief of release, the quiet easing that comes when a layer of effort finally drops away. Something that was clenched for a long time has loosened, and your system recognizes that loosening as truth. You were never meant to become someone else. You were meant to stop pretending that you were small. For much of your life, growth may have felt like distance, like moving toward a better version of yourself somewhere in the future. You may have believed that peace lived ahead of you, that clarity required more work, more understanding, more discipline. But as this journey unfolds, a simpler truth reveals itself. What you have been seeking has never been far away. It has been waiting in the spaces you rushed past, in the pauses you did not trust, in the moments you tried to fix instead of feel. The fifth dimension is not above you. It is not hidden behind effort or reward. It is here, in the way you breathe when you stop holding your breath against life. It is here, in the way your shoulders soften when you allow yourself to arrive in the moment without needing it to be different. It is here, in the way you let yourself feel what is present without turning that feeling into a problem to solve. Presence is not dramatic. It is honest. You do not enter this way of being by striving. You enter it by resting into what is already happening. When you stop resisting yourself, something fundamental changes. Life no longer feels like an opponent you must outthink or outrun. It begins to feel like a conversation you are allowed to participate in, imperfectly, sincerely, and without performance. You may notice that the mind still wants to understand everything. It wants conclusions. It wants certainty. It wants a sense of completion. But understanding is not a prerequisite for integration. Much of what is shifting now does not move through thought. It moves through the body, through sensation, through subtle changes in how you respond to the world. You do not need to force meaning onto this experience. Meaning will arrive in its own time, often quietly, often sideways, often when you are not trying to extract it. The most important thing you can offer yourself now is permission to be unfinished, permission to rest inside the questions without rushing toward answers. Tonight, you do not need to resolve anything. You do not need to make sense of everything you have felt. You do not need to organize it into insight or action. You are allowed to pause. Rest is not avoidance at this stage. It is integration. When you stop pushing for clarity, clarity has room to land. When you stop demanding progress, progress reorganizes itself around what actually matters. This is how real transformation happens. Not through pressure, but through allowance. You may have spent years fighting parts of yourself. believing that growth required discipline, correction, or constant improvement. You may have learned to motivate yourself through criticism, comparison, or urgency. And perhaps those methods carried you far enough to reach this moment, but they cannot take you further. What carries you now is gentleness. Gentleness does not mean weakness. It means accuracy. It means responding to what is actually needed instead of what you were taught to demand from yourself. It means recognizing that the nervous system opens through safety, not force, and that awareness deepens when it is welcomed, not chased. As you settle into this understanding, you may notice a quiet confidence emerging. Not the loud confidence of certainty, but the grounded confidence of presence. You trust yourself more, not because you have answers, but because you know how to stay with experience. You know how to breathe when things are unclear. You know how to pause when old habits urge you to rush. This trust changes how you move through life. You no longer feel compelled to explain your journey to everyone. You no longer need validation for what feels true. You allow others to walk their paths without needing them to match yours. And in doing so, you create space for authentic connection, the kind that does not require effort or translation. There may still be moments of doubt. There may still be days that feel heavy or unclear. These moments do not mean you are lost. They mean you are alive. Awareness does not remove contrast. It gives you a wider field in which to hold it. You learn that light and shadow are not enemies. They are movements within the same living process. Some days illuminate, some days integrate. Both are necessary. Both belong. When you stop measuring your worth by how consistently you feel clear or calm, a deep kindness enters your inner world. You speak to yourself differently. You listen more carefully. You forgive more easily. Not because you are trying to be compassionate, but because compassion is the natural response when you are no longer at war with yourself. This is what it means to come home. Home is not a destination you reach when you have healed enough. Home is the place you return to when you stop abandoning yourself in the present moment. You come home when you allow your breath to deepen without instruction. You come home when you let your body rest without guilt. You come home when you stop demanding that today prove something about your future. Nothing essential is missing from this moment. Even if your life feels unfinished, even if your path feels uncertain, uncertainty does not mean you are unprepared. It means life is still unfolding. And unfolding is not a problem to solve. It is a process to live. If there is one thing to carry with you from this space, let it be this. You do not need to go anywhere else to be whole. You do not need to transcend your humanity to be awake. You do not need to understand everything to belong to your life. You are already here, and here is enough. As you move forward, move gently. Let what you have touched settle into your ordinary days. Let it shape how you speak, how you rest, how you choose. Not through effort, but through attention. Notice what feels aligned. Notice what drains you. Trust those signals. They are intelligence, not inconvenience. And when the mind tells you that you are alone in this, pause, look more closely. You may be walking a quieter path now, but you are not walking it in isolation. Others are moving in their own ways, often invisibly, often silently, toward the same understanding. You may not always see them, you may not always recognize them, but you are part of a larger unfolding that does not require agreement to be real. True transformation rarely announces itself. It happens in quiet evenings, in softened breaths, in the decision to be kinder to yourself than you were yesterday. It happens when you choose presence over performance, honesty over habit, rest over resistance. And it happens now. So tonight, allow yourself to rest, not as an ending, but as a continuation. There is nothing to finish, nothing to prove, nothing to escape. The shift you have been sensing does not pull you away from life. It brings you back into it, more gently, more honestly, and more fully than before. You are not going anywhere else. You are coming home, and you have never been walking alone.